We'll look at colonialism in Africa. We seek to understand the origins of imperialism in Africa, examine the impact and legacy of imperialism on African society, politics, and economics, and we want to use the Congo Free State as a case study. To set the scene, keep in mind that classical Africa had a series of major kingdoms that were incredibly wealthy. They had advanced mathematics, literature, law. They had religion, some that had been imported from abroad, others that were indigenous to the area. And they lived within these traditional cultures that had developed within the continent. But going into the 1600s, many of these kingdoms are starting to decline. In some cases, it's due to internal forces, and others, it's because of events beyond their borders. So, if we were to take a look, for example, at the Kingdom of Songhai, which is roughly in this area, going into the 1600s, first off, they faced invading armies coming down here from north across the Sahara Desert and into their kingdom. And then from the south, they're facing a different growing power, which is that of European merchants. So Europeans in the 1600s, they're not really entrenched in Africa yet. They've been exploring along the African coast and establishing these trade ports in areas like the Gold Coast and in areas like modern-day Angola. But most of their attention is focused in the Americas, where they have begun a unique process of colonization. In the Americas, they have introduced diseases that have practically wiped out the indigenous populations. And this is allowing Europeans to transplant large groups of settlers across the Atlantic Ocean, where they are basically recreating Europe on a massive scale in North and South America. Now, back in Africa, what's happening with these trading posts is that they are feeding into this greater Atlantic system by providing slaves to the plantations in the Caribbean, in South America, and in the southern North American colonies. So what happens is that the Europeans, they're coming in here and they are bringing weapons, gunpowder, other trade goods that are sought by the coastal tribes. These tribes are then taking those items and using them to raid against interior kingdoms and villages. They take the slaves back to the trade ports where they are then shipped across the ocean. And so what is happening? Well, with these assaults on multiple fronts, you have these big kingdoms in the north, like Songhai, that are just basically overwhelmed. Now, the Europeans did not turn their attention really to Africa until the middle to late 1800s. Prior to this, what was going on? Well, 15, 16, 1700s, again, they are focused on colonization in the Americas. And it's not until the late 1700s that they start to lose these colonies to a series of revolutions that really begin with the revolutions of the Revolution of the 13 Colonies, in other words, the American Revolution. They try to hang on, but by the 1830s, they've pretty much lost all of their colonies. Now, at that point, Europeans were interested in establishing colonies elsewhere, but they lacked the tools that they needed to colonize other parts of the world. And what were the tools that they needed? Well, first of all, they needed medicine. In the 1800s, when Europeans start colonizing again, they are mostly doing so in the tropical regions of the world. And there were diseases like malaria that were endemic to those areas that just really killed Europeans in large numbers. So until they were able to get the medicine, they were unable to really, gain a foothold in Africa. So they needed medicine. Second thing they needed was a new form of transportation. When they relied on sailboats in the 16 and 1700s, it took a long time to get people and to get material across the ocean where they needed it. So an example is in India. By the 1700s, the British are in India, but it took upwards to 6 months to a year to send a message to India and then simply get a response. So that's pretty slow. Well, by the 1830s, we have the invention or the perfection of the steam engine, which is now being used on railroads. And so the steam engine, the steamboat, the railroad, this is going to provide a more efficient form of transportation that will help Europeans in their colonial efforts. The last piece of the puzzle, if you will, were advanced weaponry. Going into the 1850s, how has weaponry changed? Well, rifles shoot farther, they shoot more accurately, and because of a breech loading design, you can now reload much faster. Add to that, by the 1860s and 70s, we're starting to see the very first prototypes of machine guns. Field artillery is much more powerful. Overall, just the weapons that Europeans are able to produce are much more lethal than any weapons produced in other parts of the world. So, late 1800s, they have all three of these items that they need, and colonialism in Africa and in Asia begins in earnest. So Africa was one of the first places that Europeans turned their attention to. And in the 1870s and 1880s, there was this major race for colonies in this part of the world. And so when historians look at this time, they refer to it as the scramble for Africa. So it begins in the 1870s, continues into the 1880s, and doesn't finish until really the early 1890s. It's a period of just Europeans going out there trying to gobble up as much territory as possible. Now, keep in mind that Europeans at this time, they didn't have a European Union. They didn't have, systems to prevent conflict like they do today. And they didn't really like each other. So there was a big concern that what would eventually happen is you'd have these English armies, marching around Africa. They would potentially meet a French army somewhere on a savanna or a desert in a rainforest. Words would be exchanged, gunfire exchange, and the next thing you know, there's conflict here, which quickly spills over up there in Europe. To prevent this, what did the Europeans do? Well, they came together from 1884 to 1885 in what's known as the Berlin Conference and set the rules for colonization. And the rules were pretty basic. If you had a presence on the coast, you had claim to the interior lands of Africa. So presence on the coast meant a claim to the interior. And so those powers that actually had established colonies early on in the 15 and 1600s, they had a head start because they had these claims. Countries that didn't have these claims, well, they were going to get what was left over. Now, keep in mind that Africans were not consulted on this. This was a conference that just hosted European powers. So once they have the rules of the game, this is when things really take off and Europeans begin racing for territory. So what happens as a result of this? Well, this is why the map of Africa during the colonial years, up through the 1960s, looked the way it did. Great Britain with its presence, they're going to expand up in this area. They're going to penetrate down from Egypt and west from Kenya. This is mostly going to be France up here in West Africa. And then down here, you're going to get the Johnny-come-latelys with the Germans and the Portuguese and the Spanish. Today, this continues to have an impact. If you go to Africa, any of the countries that are in this region right here, most likely they're going to be Francophone. You're going to be able to speak French there. These countries here, what are they going to speak? Well, they're going to speak English. So this is how the Europeans divided up territory among themselves. Again, they used the steam engine, they used medicine, they used weaponry to advance their territorial claims. The question is, how exactly did they govern afterwards? Well, they governed by a method known as indirect rule. Again, in the Americas, you had a European population that replaced an indigenous population, Native American population. In Africa and Asia, you would always have an African population, Asian population. They didn't die off because of disease. Why? Because they had been trading with Europeans and with other parts of the world, you know, since human beings began migrating and trading, and so they had immunities to these illnesses. So this basically means that when the Europeans go into these countries, what you're going to have is a large population down there, and then you're going to have this smaller, outnumbered European population. So how do you govern that? Well, the Europeans would send off usually a small group of administrators. These were the people that were going to govern and oversee the day-to-day affairs. And in addition to administrators, they would send off a contingent from their military. The administrators, once they got to Africa, they would go into the tribal areas and they would try to find chiefs or leaders or kings that they could work with. If this guy was someone they couldn't work with, well, no problem. We're just going to replace him with someone that will work with us. And then the idea becomes really basic. The policy, the directions go down to the local level, to the local leader that's either there already or that the Europeans choose as the leader. And then he's responsible for actually overseeing it. So the question is, okay, what happens if the people refuse to follow these instructions? What if they refuse to build the bridge or to provide taxes or, do some other, to quit practicing a certain religious belief, whatever it is? Well, then you have the military. And that's where they come in with those advanced weaponry, and they basically force the policy on the indigenous population. So this is one aspect of indirect rule, using small groups of Europeans to govern large, huge populations of Asians and Africans. And when we get to South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, we're going to see this all over again. Now, another thing that they did is they used the approach of divide and conquer. So when they came up with these colonial borders, again, they did not consult Africans. They did not really care about the desires of Africans in this area. This was all for European needs. So, in the case of Nigeria, for example, if you look at its borders, it cuts through this territory, and this territory doesn't have one. It has many, many different tribal groups within its boundaries. Today, I think there's 20 or 30 or more. And then on top of that, the boundaries of Nigeria actually cut another tribe, the Fulani, in half, with part of their tribe existing in English-speaking Nigeria, the other part of the tribe existing in French-speaking French West Africa. Now let's complicate this a little bit more. The Fulani up there, they are Islamic. They're Muslims. They practice Islam. So what do the British do? Well, they promote the conversion of the southern tribes to Christianity. Keep in mind, at this time, Islamic communities and Christian communities didn't necessarily get along. There had been a long history of antagonism going all the way back to the Crusades. So what does this do? Well, it guarantees that the British can go in here and they can favor this group or they can favor this other group, and that'll keep these two right here kind of arguing amongst themselves. They're fighting amongst themselves. They don't like each other. And what does that mean? Well, it means that they're not going to get together as a unified group to oppose the British. And wherever you go throughout these colonies, this was a common thing. So if you want to understand why in the 1990s and the early 2000s there was a lot of hostility and open conflict and violence, especially on the part of northern Sudan against South Sudan, it's because these folks right up here were Islamic. These people down here were Christian under the colonial period. And the same goes true out here, where you have an Islamic population and an Islamic population, and in the same time period, these guys were also going in and raiding these villages. Why? Because, well, these were different ethnic groups. If you go into the 1990s in Rwanda, which is located roughly right about here, why were the Hutus and the Tutsi? Why were the Hutus committing genocide against the Tutsis? Well, the Tutsis were the tribe, the smaller of the two tribes that the Belgians used to police the Hutus, and they did so with a pretty heavy hand. And so after the Belgians left in the 1960s and 70s, there's this 20-year period where there's more or less peace, and then in the 1990s it breaks out with the Hutus literally trying to kill all the Tutsis within Rwanda. In fact, the Hutu-dominated government branded the Tutsis as cockroaches. That's the word that they used, and they urged all of their people within the borders of Rwanda to kill all the cockroaches, as they would say. And so it turns into this horrific period in world history. So these are the means by which the Europeans governed Africa. And what's happening within these societies? Well, they're disrupting traditional societies, disrupting traditional family units. Old religions sometimes are being straight up outlawed, or they're being undermined. Traditional African education's being undermined. There's they do have schools for African children, but they don't really intend to send these kids off to college or produce future leaders. Really, they're just providing enough education to African children so that way they can have this next generation of African administrators come up to help the British or the French or the Portuguese govern the colony. In terms of infrastructure, the things that make an economy go, are they building railroads? Well, yeah, they'll build a railroad in French West Africa or in Mozambique, but it's not to get people around the country. It's to get resources from point A to point B where it can then be shipped back to France. So this means that these improvements are just meant for one thing, that's resource extraction elsewhere. So a lot of lost resources, a lot of lost wealth. And basically what's going to happen is when the Europeans leave in the 1960s, they're going to leave Africa playing catch-up with no money to use to build the things that they need to catch up. And that's been one of the big struggles for African nations since then. So we looked at, the origins. We looked at, some generalities in terms of how Europeans colonized Africa. And now we're going to turn our attention to the Belgian Congo as a case study. So in this case, just heads up, this is worst case scenario when it comes to colonialism. We could look at a number of different colonies, German East Africa. We could look at South Africa. We could look at Egypt. But in this case, the Belgian Congo is like the worst of the worst. So this story starts with Henry Morton Stanley. He's an explorer that it was hired by King Leopold II of Belgium, this guy right here. Back then, if you wanted to become famous in Europe and in the United States, all you had to do was go on and, go explore some never before seen part of Africa or Asia, come back, write a book about it, promote the book, and voila, you're famous. It's a pretty common thing to be done for celebrities back then. So Henry Morton Stanley, he's one of those guys. And Leopold II contacts him, says, hey, I want you to go down to the Congo and find out what's there. Is it worth colonizing? Henry Morton Stanley went to the Congo. He came back and said, yes, they have resources. They've never encountered European. They've never seen our weapons. We'll have all the advantages on our side. So Leopold II, what did he do next? Well, he's a small country. He can't do anything because he doesn't really have a military. So he sent emissaries to the Berlin Conference, and they convinced other major European powers to give all of this territory to Leopold II. Belgium traditionally was a neutral power in Europe. And so what Leopold does, he says, okay, we'll provide like this neutral middle ground right here where you don't have to worry about a conflict over this valuable territory spilling over into Europe. And in exchange for my control of it, I will open up all of this territory to English and French and German and Portuguese and other companies. So you get a piece of the pie. And on top of that, he promised to go in here and promote democracy and education and Christianity and do all these wonderful things to help the people of the Belgian Congo. So what did they do? They gave it to him. Well, right off the bat, he did the complete opposite. Instead of actually outlawing slavery, he effectively allowed private companies and private contractors to go in there, enslave the African population, and terrorize them. So one of the first projects they started focusing on was the construction of a railroad network around a system of cataracts on the Congo River. So in this picture, the cataracts are these waterfalls, these incredibly steep waterfalls that make navigation up the Congo impossible. The idea was build a railroad around it and then make it easier to transport supplies and goods and resources up the river and down the river. So what do the railroad companies do to create this? Well, they basically go into villages and they say, okay, you are going to provide free labor for X number of days and you don't have a choice about it, which, in today's parlance, we, as well as back then, we call that slavery. Workers on the railroad were forced to work long hours with subpar conditions, exhausting, back-breaking work, and if they did not work fast enough, if they were too exhausted to work, if they refused to work, then what the overseers would do is they would use this chicote right here. Chicote is basically a whip, a double-pronged whip made out of hippopotamus hide. And they would basically take the individual, they would take stakes, drive them into the ground, bind the individual face down on the ground, and then just start beating this poor human being senseless in front of other people to show what happens if you refuse to work. Another project that was really valuable was the collection and sale of ivory. So ivory, you could do one of two things. You could either go out and hunt the elephant, kill it, take the ivory yourself, which could be time-consuming and costly, or you could do what a number of ivory hunters did, which was just go, hire local tribesmen as mercenaries and raid villages that had ivory that you didn't want to purchase it from. And this was pretty commonplace, and they didn't really care if they killed people in the process. And finally, there was the collection of rubber. Now, today we make rubber out of synthetic material. Back then, you harvested it from trees. It's the gummy sap that came from rubber trees. And it took 10 years on plantations for trees to grow to a point that you could actually harvest them. So, again, what did they do? Well, they took shortcuts. They would go into a village. Agents would go into a village. They would hire members of a different tribe to provide the muscle for what they were about to do. And once they were in the village, they would take all the women and the children captive, and they would tell the men, okay, you have only so much time to collect so many pounds of rubber. And so the men would have to go out into the rainforest, and then usually what you did is you cut into the tree's vines, and you let the sap run over your torso, over your chest, because you wanted it to dry, so that way when you ripped it off your chest and hopefully didn't take too much skin with it, it would kind of create the sheet that was easier to carry. So what happened if you didn't meet your quota? Well, what happened to you is what happened to this father right here. That's his daughter's hand and foot that he got back, and that's all he got back of the young lady. Basically, they would kill the family members, send appendages back to the parents, and then say, okay, this is what happens if you don't do what we tell you to do. So what happens? Initially, Leopold II gets away with this. Nobody knows what's going on in the Congo, and he's billing it, promoting it as this great experiment in democracy. Well, you had a number of African American journalists back in the United States that were interested in this. Keep in mind, the United States, African Americans faced violence at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan. Lynching was not, and technically is not, still illegal at the federal level. You had discrimination, you had segregation, all these bad things. And so there was this big interest in the African American community of an African country run by Africans. So what happened? Well, when these journalists went over there, they started finding out what was really happening: slave labor, brutal treatment, all these horrors, and they started reporting on it. And once the international community caught wind of it, Leopold II, basically became an international villain. So this is an example of a political cartoon from the time period, and it shows Leopold II here, and these are severed heads. Another practice that they found out is there was this one ivory hunter in particular. But some of these ivory hunters, some of these contractors that were working down there were just vicious. So one guy in particular that became famous after a young writer by the name of Joseph Conrad wrote a book called Heart of Darkness about it. But this one hunter would go out there and he would attack these villages, and then he would go back home and decorate his yard by driving stakes in the ground and putting severed heads on top of the stakes. Real nasty, brutal, inhumane treatment. So by 1908, what happened is that the Belgian government, the Belgian legislature, was forced to finally take control of the Belgian Congo, the Congo Free State, from Leopold II. But within those short 23 years, historians estimate that anywhere from 8 to 10 million people died at the hands of ivory hunters, railroad builders, and rubber agents from rubber companies. So in the case of Europe, keep in mind this is kind of the last area that they begin to colonize. They begin to colonize it late because initially their attention's fixed on the Western Hemisphere. Once, though, they're kicked out of the Western Hemisphere and they get access to the 3 types of technology they need, they develop a system of indirect rule to govern large native populations. This all occurs by the 1860s and 70s, and that's when the race for Africa is on. And today, when we take a look at modern African issues like conflict, poverty, lack of economic development, a lot of people wonder, oh, gee, why? Why is Africa so far behind economically? Why do they have a lot of nasty wars? Well, if you want to understand that answer to that question, just simply go back and study their past during the 1800s, during the age of colonialism.